What's the difference between the classic Greek statues and modern bodybuilding? Let's discuss that. So the modern bodybuilder has a massive chest, huge biceps, a narrow waist, and massive quads, all coupled with low body fat percentages, of course. This creates a sort of X frame. The reason things are the way they are in modern bodybuilding is because it shows the maximal development and the maximal separation of each muscle. For Greek statues, it was more about the practical functions of the society that they lived in. So let's talk more specifically about why bodybuilding seems to accentuate certain muscle groups. Part of this has to do with our aesthetic sensibilities and how they've changed over time. The reason we have a lot of adoration for big biceps is that they're seen through our clothes, right? Because when a guy's wearing short sleeve clothes, you can see his biceps. We know someone works out because we can see a hint of it ever so slightly through his clothes. If you can see someone's muscles through their sleeves, it implies that they work out, and of course, working out implies that you have a lot of vitality, that you're very healthy, and of course that's very attractive to everyone who looks at it. And something similar holds true for the chest. It pops out through the shirt, especially when it's really pronounced. The appeal of a narrow waist and big quads is mainly something you see in bodybuilding competitions, but generally speaking, people are also into narrow waists and big quads nowadays. This has somewhat changed over time when, back in the 80s and 70s, big legs weren't that as much of a big deal because the legs didn't accentuate the wide back as much. If you had big legs, it didn't accentuate the wide back as much, but that's changed very significantly over time. And this makes sense because, as I said before, the goal of bodybuilding is to show as much discernment between each muscle group. Therefore, having a small waist to pronounce the wide back shows more discernment. It shows greater separation and accentuates how big your back actually is. It also highlights how big your quads are if you have a small waist. And of course, low body fat is a hallmark for bodybuilding for this very reason. Obviously, it's a bit there in Greek statues as well, but it's not as important. Yeah, low body shows the striations in your chest, the peaks of your biceps, and the shreds in your quads a lot better. Such is really hard to display at higher body fat percentages. So yeah, if I had to define what modern bodybuilding is, it is definition and pronouncement. So it's how shredded you are and how big the muscles are and how much they're pronounced within your physique. The Greek statue aesthetics have more to do with what would be perceived to be an ideal structure for performing day-to-day tasks as optimally as possible. Now, the statues themselves are probably a bit idealized, but they still display a sort of ideal for the Greeks that they believed in. The forearms in these statues are very large because they're essential to grab onto things. They didn't have anatomically designed dumbbells and barbells with handles that you can grip on. They had to lift animals and stones all the time. These structures, for a lack of a better word, came in a lot of precarious forms, not nice handles that you can grip onto for the dumbbells. So this forced you to have bigger forearms. The forearms, I believe, were also the same size as their bicep. That's what they believed at the time. And the bicep at the time didn't really have much function. Think about when you're stabbing someone or where you're throwing something or anything like that. You don't really use your bicep. You do use it a bit when you're picking something up, but it's not as much as other muscle groups. I think a good example to explain what I'm talking about is to look at, football players. In football, you have to push each other around and all that stuff. And same with rugby and any other high contact sport. This would use your shoulders, your traps, your triceps, and your core muscles a lot more than it would your biceps. Which is why the football aesthetic doesn't really have, they tend to not have very dominating biceps. Just look at DK Metcalf, for example. Very strong shoulders, traps, chest, but his biceps are kind of lacking comparatively. He also has a very thick waist, which is similar to the Greek statues. A thicker waist, generally speaking, can generate more power than a thinner waist. Look at strongmen, for example. They have almost Neanderthal-type builds, and their core muscles appropriately are very thick. Their pre-model movement requirements also require them to do a lot of twisting and torquing. This requires movement in the transverse plane, which works on the side of your abs and the oblique area a lot, which ends up making your core a bit thicker. The statues also had very strong backs because, of course, that's the muscle you use when swinging, slashing, and slinging bows. They didn't have massive V-tapers like we do now because, of course, they have thicker cores, but they were still incredibly defined when you look at the statues. They also had really good glutes, and that's likely because glutes are a very good predictor of athletic performance. They're integral for things like jumping high and running fast, for example. So, while the modern bodybuilder is supposed to show off each muscle group in the most pronounced way possible, the Greek bodies are attuned to their way of life. Some may consider this to be a more functional looking physique and a more natural looking physique. Not just the fact that they didn't take steroids, but the fact that their bodies were ideal for a sort of pre-modern lifestyle. They weren't augmented by unnatural equipment. Although, I mean, the entire concept of functional training is very much misunderstood as far as I'm concerned, and if you want to know why that's the case, then click on the video here. Thanks for watching. Peace.